Good morning again. We are here treating the transatlantic slave trade as part of our effort to understand West Africa history in the 19th century. So we'll be looking at the slave trade in West Africa, its impact, then the its abolition in West Africa. Don't forget to share, to like, and to subscribe to this YouTube channel for more tutorials on historical subjects that you want. So we're looking at the transatlantic slave trade. It is one of the ironies of African history that at the end of isolation made possible through the maritime revolution that which should have led in less than a century to a new commerce in which Africa's chief export was its own people. It is such a devastating and catastrophic development that Africa, after several years of its isolation from the outside world, with the remarkable achievement through the construction of sophisticated ships that could sail through the Atlantic Ocean. This contact was actually characterized by an exchange of humans. So people say that slaves were captured from Africa, but slaves were not captured from Africa. People were captured from West Africa and made into slaves in the European plantations in America, Europe, and in the Caribbean. But for us to have a broad understanding of the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa, it will be very, very important for us to define slavery. What is slavery? So we would take a minute to conceptualize slavery. Slavery is a system based on forcing other people to work for another person without any remuneration, with either in form of cash or kind. So the first person who is compelled to work lacking control over his or her own production or productivity. This means that it is a condition of being held in servitude as a property of someone else. Conceptually, slavery is also characterized by extremely hard labor coupled with physical and moral abuse, exploitation, and inhuman treatment. The Microsoft Encounter Dictionary defines slavery as a social institution defined by law and custom as the most absolute involuntary form of human servitude. This definitive feature of slaves are as follows: their labor or services are obtained through force. Their physical beings are regarded as a property of another person. Their owner, that is, their lord, are in full charge of their productivity and their output without any reward. Since earliest time, slaves have been legally defined as things, therefore they could, among other things, other possibility be bought. So it is possible for slaves to be acquired and to be also be disposed, all right, for pecuniary purposes. So they could be sold, traded, or given as gifts, or pledged for a debt by their owners, usually without any recourse to personal or legal objection or restraint. So slavery could be described also as a legal economic system in which principles of property law are applied to human, therefore allowing them to be classified as property, to be owned, to be bought, sold accordingly, and they cannot in which they cannot withdraw their services, any terms or condition. So while a person is enslaved, the owner is entitled to the productivity of the slave labor without any remuneration or compensation. But how did this come to be in West Africa? What was the root of this obnoxious system, which Africans were subjected to, between 15th century and the 19th century? The process was basically molded by economic reason. In the late 15th century and early 16th century, there was a major transformation, a remarkable innovation, birthed by the maritime revolution. Europeans struck out their tiny land and discovered a new area known as the New World. So the discovery of the New World, through the maritime revolution and the power it bequeathed through mastery of the sea, gave the Europeans the power, to reconfigure, the economic landscape of West Africa. Prominent among the various Europeans who pioneered this voyage of exploration were, Christopher Columbus, who reached the Americas. We have Vasco da Gama, who got to India via the West African coast. So as we have mentioned, the transatlantic slave trade contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa, as Walter Rodney, has noted in his classic work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, because the Europeans targeted the strongest men and women, that is, those with high artisanal, intellectual, and artisanal capacity, such as the warrior, the palm wine tappers, the goldsmiths, the blacksmiths, the hunters, the orators, farmers, musicians, and diviners, among others in African society. The only categories of people left behind were the feeble, the children, and the weak and lazy or handicapped, and the aged, who were clearly out of the economic equation of European capitalist enterprise in West Africa. They also, of course, ignored the corrupt kings, the village chiefs and head of communities and their cohorts, who, for the fears of their lives or the need to worship the gods of their stomach, of their bellies, had collaborated with the Europeans, obtaining guns, and other ammunitions, through in which they used to prosecute anarchy, among their people. So the point is that the transatlantic slave trade, an institution which lasted for over 400 years, distorted the rhythm of agricultural, socio-political, and existential realities in West Africa. Other people who were also not captured were those who had been able to escape, the incessant raid, the terror, and the torment, of their fellow Africans who had obtained guns and weapons from the European invaders. So all of this have been well summarized by Bishop Maury of France, in his argument against France ending slave trade and giving freedom to its slave colonies in the 19th century. Right, which he presented an argument, in the French National Assembly in 1791, and it was captioned: if you were to lose each year more than 200 lives, that you get from your colonies, if you had not the exclusive trade with your colonies to feed your manufacture, to maintain your navy, to keep your agriculture going, and to pay your imports, to provide for your luxury needs, to advantageously balance your trade with Europe and Asia, then I say it clearly, the kingdom be irretrievably lost. So the transatlantic slave trade, as we are going to demonstrate, is a significant component of the development that occurred in Europe between 15th century and the 19th century. It was the bedrock of the superstructure of American commerce and the British modernity, during this period. So all of this has been quite illustrated earlier. Of course, it will be noted that Africa constituted not only the labor and the ingenuity of Africa was the root of the capital formation, that actually laid the foundation for the development in Europe. What did Africa and Africans get in return, for this, transatlantic slave trade? Despite the foggy, twisted, and guilted, bread rationalization of many Western scholars, the very concise summation of Walter Rodney, the late Guyanese historian, is quite very relevant. Cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots, kettle full of holes, beads, and other assorted rubbish, were some of the goods, brought into Africa in exchange for humans, which the Europeans derided as slaves. So, that the source of slaves came to be quickly located in wars, in kidnapping and raiding, made their incidence to rise sharply, leading simultaneously to insecurity of life and property. That is to say that the transatlantic slave trade, among other issues, actually ignited insecurity, which affected the economy of West Africa in catastrophic proportion. Many societies and kingdoms were destabilized as a result of this anarchy, brought in by the transatlantic slave trade. By and large, man came to live, the life of a brigand and pirate and hooligans, within the society, degenerating to obedient state of nature, in which life became nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, and survival of the fittest became the de facto order. So the transatlantic slave trade introduced by the Europeans distorted the West African society and economy over the period of 400 years. In the chaos that followed, when the ethnic groups of Guinea-Bissau were played against one another, in the raid of slaves, Europeans came to describe it as a slave trader's paradise. So it is important to understand the European creation of African underdevelopment, while we try to estimate the nature to the nuisance value of Africans in the 21st century. West Africa lost most of our able-bodied men in this process, leaving behind the infirm, the aged, and the very young, and the handicapped. So the transatlantic slave trade destabilized, and as destabilized as the continent became by the ravages of the raid, the wars, the slave trade and the slavery, there was no productive activities for over 400 years when the slave trade. So it was no surprise that these acts were unwittingly to provide the solid foundation for Europe's easy colonial conquest that followed, and which laid the continent prostrate under yet another term of political domination and economic exploitation for over 70 years. So this too was the case with the Caribbean and other parts of the New World, where Europe and America had foothold. The dehumanization and the sheer cruelty that attended the slave trade and slavery, right from African sources to their destinations, constitute the most chilling pages in the history of mankind. The denigration, the abuses, the torture, the rape, murder of slaves, in either on the African soil, on the Atlantic, ocean, or even in the New World, was one of the greatest, vilest offense against humanity in the history of mankind. Perhaps equal not, by the lot of the Jews under the Nazi Germany. From the Ninth Book comes the narration about slaves, in the West Indies. When they are brought to us, as the Ninth Book narrated, the planters buy them out of the ships, and they were, they find them stark naked. Africans were naked, therefore cannot be deceived, in any outward deformity. So the treatment and the European disposition to the slaves actually was not just did not have its own economic undertone, but it had its social and psychological degradation. They choose them as they do horses in the market. The stronger the youth, fullest and the most beautiful yield the greatest prizes. 30 pounds sterling, for instance, was the price in the 18th century, for the best man negro. For you to understand the level of degradation and denigration of African humanity, and 25 and 26 or 27 pounds for a woman. Children at best, the highest rate, also in the 18th century. Africa too is still stitching. Of course, the impact of the transatlantic slave trade is still very, very much profound, on the African soil. Africa is still stitching her aged wounds, trying to lift herself up from the morass of wreckage, into which 400 years of slavery, and another 70 years of colonialism by Europe and America, sunk her. The institutionalization of the transatlantic slave trade was particularly the root of the capital formation that led to the development of European modernity. That means to say that the labor and ingenuity of Africans, who were subjected to this nefarious inhuman treatment in the New World, was a constitutive element of the process or factors that brought about food security, urbanization, industrial and scientific development in Western societies. In Africa, the forceful shipment of able-bodied men and women drained the continent, the region, sub-region of the intellectual, socio-economic, and political resources that should have contributed to the growth and development of West Africa. So this actually accounts for the level of underdevelopment in contemporary society. The export of slaves from Africa in this direction lasted several centuries, even into the early 20th century after the slave trade had been abolished. The number exported annually were very significant, although several scholars have debated about the quantum of slaves captured from West Africa and sold to Europe and America during the period of the obnoxious slave trade. The capital accumulated in Liverpool from the slave trade spread into the hinterland to induce the growth of the textile industry in Manchester, for instance. I said it was the root of the capital formation and modernity in Europe. By 1788, trade in Manchester textile to Africa stood at 200,000 euros annually. Of this, 180,000 euros worth was to the Negro Africa, was through the slaves in Negro Africa. The production of this textile produced in Manchester, production of textile materials involved a sum of 300,000 euros annually and provided employment for over 180,000 men in Europe. It should also be noted that the cotton woven by Manchester looms was produced in the West Indies by Negro labor. The need to process this raw material from West Indies also gave rise to refining industries in Europe, especially in Britain, while Africa continues to be depleted of its human capital and resources. The same fact was applicable to France, where the trade in slaves stimulated the economy and led to the growth of such cities as Bordeaux, Marseille, and Nancy, among others. The British North America's large-scale involvement in the Atlantic system during the colonial period produced differing economic and social structures in southern, middle, and northern colonies in West Africa. The point we have noted that by the 19th century, when the transatlantic slave trade was effectively abolished, the economic, social institutions in West Africa had been placed on prostrate state. The various productive enterprises in West Africa had virtually collapsed as a result of the insecurity, as a result of the tension, as a result of the disorderliness created by the transatlantic slave trade instituted by the Europeans. It was one of the most atrocities committed against African humanity, in which Africa's major export commodity was its own people. Of course, this event actually precipitated, among other things, disorderliness in West African society. It brought in anarchy, it brought in underdevelopment, lack of production, and collapse of order in West African society. And this is a major factor in the underdevelopment of West Africa, even as we speak. Thank you.